Welcome back to Grid Drop. Today we're going to cover my top 5 tips for getting faster on F123. I'm going to break down this video into 5 segments, one for each tip. These tips are all equally important, and I've arranged the video to cover each of these in the order that I see fit. These tips consist of learning the track, power output, pedals and rotation, eye placement, and lastly, assists. If you do enjoy this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing, and feel free to join my Discord, which is linked in the description. That being said, let's get into the first tip. Track knowledge is an extremely important aspect of racing, especially in F1 where each tenth really matters and precision is key. By knowing the safest curbs, different track surfaces, the flow from corner to corner, and the ideal braking points, you can save yourself lots of time on each lap. There are many different avenues to take in order to get familiar with the track. The first thing you have to test is the limit of the car. When driving on a new or unfamiliar track, you have 2 options. Option 1 is to take a few laps to slowly warm up to the track, getting familiar with the layout and working the car up to the limit, or option 2 is going as fast as you possibly can for those first few laps and surpassing the limit of the car, but using those mistakes to find that very fine line that is the limit. Either one works, it just depends on your driving style. Both of these methods help you find the limit of the car for each corner and how hard you can push the car without making a mistake. These methods will also greatly increase your track knowledge, as you'll be getting used to the feeling of the car around each corner and the lap as a whole. The best thing to do is to experiment with what method works best for you. If you're already decently familiar with the track but still find yourself missing braking points, going wide at apexes, or any other mistakes like this, these methods will also be extremely helpful. Chances are, if you consistently make mistakes lap after lap, you probably have some bad habits that you need to fix. In order to fix them, taking a step back to relearn the track is necessary. The most important thing to note here is that yes, practice makes perfect, but bad habits in practice will lead to bad habits overall. When implementing these methods, really pay attention to the details and work on consistency. When doing laps and time trials, focus on those micro errors that make you lose a little bits of time. Maybe you could get on the power a little bit earlier in one corner, or have a better exit on another one. Once you're lapping at full speed, remember those small errors and focus on correcting them one corner at a time. Really lock in on those small mistakes each lap, and soon you'll be shaving tenths off your lap pretty consistently. That's all I'm going to say for now, but I do have a much more in-depth video explaining this on my channel, and you should check that one out once you're done with this one. To summarize, experiment with those methods when learning a new track, and if you're already semi-comfortable with the track, focus in on those small errors and correcting them at each corner. Track knowledge is the first step to getting faster, and although it's not the most exciting of subjects, it should definitely not be ignored. Something I never see talked about in other tips videos is power output. In the F1 games, getting on the power as fast as you can is key to faster lap times. So how can we do that? To understand this better, we need to break down the entry and the exit of a corner. After reaching your braking point, obviously you start braking. Now, as you're releasing pressure from the brake in order to avoid locking up, you start turning into the corner, pulling in as tight as you can to the apex. Once at the apex, this is where you should be getting back on the power. Now obviously, a sudden spike in throttle will cause you to spin, but the moral of the story here is that as a general rule of thumb, the apex of the corner is where you need to get back on the power. Now, a general rule of thumb isn't why you clicked on this video. Let's break it down further. Getting back on the power at the apex does in fact apply to most corners, but not all of them. Some corners are very unique, like the long sweeping right of turn 1 in China. These kinds of corners are unconventional and require a completely different approach. However, for most other corners on most other tracks, putting the power down at the apex is the best way to go. By waiting even fractions of a second longer to get on the throttle, you minimize your exit speed and add time to your lap. Do this at every corner for the entirety of a lap, and you can easily exceed 5/10 of unnecessary time. In order to practice this, there are a few things you can do. Go into time trials and select the most comfortable track for you, but preferably something with a good variety of conventional corners. I recommend something like Bahrain. This track is generally pretty easy and has a good mix of hard braking zones, slow speed corners, and high speed corners. Now, once on the track, really accentuate that throttle input at the apex. Don't be afraid to spin out. It's a time trial, you're allowed to make mistakes. By pushing on these laps and even spinning out several times, you're learning the limit of the car. This goes hand in hand with our first tip about learning the track. Now, once you have more of a feeling for the limit of the throttle, get a bit more serious about these laps. Try to get back on the power at the apex, or just as early as you possibly can without compromising your line. It's important to note that power output is important, but getting back on the power too early is just as detrimental as getting on it too late. There's a sweet spot for each corner, and it's actually a much bigger margin than you might think. Let's look at a few examples in Bahrain. Here's an example of what it might look like when waiting just a bit too long to get onto power. Yes, I stay on my line and nothing really looks wrong, but in terms of timing, there's definitely room for improvement. Now let's watch some examples of proper throttle input. Watch my throttle input in relation to these corners. Notice how early I'm getting on the power, and then upon exiting, my rate of increase in the throttle. These corners are all different, yet the same principle applies. Brake, turn in, hit the apex, back on the power, and follow through to the exit. If we take a look at an example in slow motion, you can really pick apart the spots where I get back on the power. I know this seems like such a small detail, but it's a mistake I notice a lot of people make, yet a lot of these guides never mention it. This is definitely something to practice and experiment with, and once you get used to being a little more aggressive with that initial throttle input and trusting the car a little bit more, you'll notice much faster lap times pretty much immediately. Along with being diligent on the throttle input at the apex of the corner, there's even more work you can do with your pedals in order to get faster. In this segment, we're going to cover the role pedals play in terms of rotating the car through a corner. So what do I mean when I say rotate the car? Well, rotating the car can also be described as pitching the front end of the car into a corner without any understeer. Ideally, for each corner, you want a good rotation, meaning you want the front end of the car to respond well and pull into the corner. As weird as it may sound, the pedals are just as important as the steering wheel when it comes to cornering. The first thing to understand about using pedals for rotation is trail braking. When heading into a braking zone, trail braking is the most effective way to slow down the car in time for the corner, especially with an F1 car. To trail brake effectively, at your braking point, slam on the brakes to reach a 100% brake input. Under braking now, hold at 100% for a little, and then slowly release that pressure until you reach the turn-in point. By doing this, you put all that forward momentum and weight on the front tires with the initial hard braking, and releasing that pressure alleviates the weight on the front, creating more rotation into the corner. Another way to use the pedals to rotate the car actually comes at the mid-corner point. Now, we just covered when to get on the throttle, but there are actually some more options. For example, in certain corners, you can take slight jabs at the throttle. Ayrton Senna was famous for driving with this style around the corners, and although he may have done it to keep the turbo spooling in his era of Formula 1, it's an extremely effective way to get some more rotation into a corner. Now, this method doesn't translate for every corner. However, the reason it creates rotation is because it puts more pressure on the rear of the car. When going around a corner, these jabs at the throttle use that pressure to keep the front end light, therefore reducing understeer and increasing front end rotation. For this tip, the best thing you can do is practice and experiment with these methods. Trail braking applies to most corners, and jabbing at the throttle is a little bit less applicable, so use these methods around a few different tracks to feel the effects on the car. By using the pedals to rotate the front end, you can really eliminate a lot of understeer in corners, and get those front wheels to behave the way you want them to. I've talked about eye placement in many other tips videos, but I cannot hammer this one home enough. We've talked about throttle control at mid-corner and using the pedals to rotate into the corner, but there's one final step to really getting the most out of every corner, and that's eye placement. When I say eye placement, I'm talking about where you physically look in each stage of the corner. This is extremely important, as proper eye placement really makes each corner much more approachable. When entering a corner, obviously you have to glance at your braking point. Now, preferably it should always be in your peripheral vision, but unless you know the track really well, that might not always be the case. So when entering the corner, glance at the braking point. As soon as you do this, shift your focus to the apex of the corner. Hitting the braking point now and utilizing that method of trail braking, keep your eyes focused on the apex. By doing this, it'll create natural harmony between your vision and your depth perception, allowing you to turn in at the most natural point. This concept is a bit weird to explain, so let's look at some examples. Into this corner, I should be braking around 100 meters. I take a quick glance at my braking point and store it in my brain. Now, I shift my focus to the apex of the corner. Using my peripheral vision now, I see I'm at the braking point and I brake. Under braking now, I keep my eyes focused on that apex. By doing so, I make it much easier to flow through the corner naturally. Still focusing on that apex, I'm able to naturally turn into the corner. Now, at the mid-corner point, I shift my focus to where the car should be placed on the exit. Once looking at that point, my brain naturally calculates what it takes to reach that point. It's similar to driving a car in real life. Think about making a left turn or a right turn on the road. Before you turn and as you're turning, your eyes are focused on where the car should go, and your brain computes the rest, therefore letting your body follow through. By focusing your vision on where you want the car to be placed, your brain and body naturally follow. This is extremely important in racing. If you're focusing on the track ahead, you're gonna be slower. However, if you focus on the parts of the track where you know you need the car to be, it makes it a lot more natural. To practice this, hop into time trials and do some laps at half speed. really putting some extra effort into focusing on where the car should be placed. Check the braking point, look at the apex, brake, keep looking at the apex, turn in, and at mid-corner, physically look where you want the car to be placed on exit. Once this becomes a natural habit, you'll notice some huge improvements in lap times. Lastly, and this one really applies to those trying to get faster, disable your assists, namely ABS, traction control, and the racing line. I will say this mostly applies to those playing with a racing wheel. If you mainly play on a controller, I completely understand having ABS and traction control. If you play on a wheel but still use those assists, what's the point? By purchasing a racing wheel, no matter if your setup costs $5,000 or $200, you're still paying for a more in-depth experience, which translates to more control. You have the ability to modulate your braking, control your throttle, and access much more precise steering. When you use these assists, you limit all of these capabilities. And listen, I get it, turning off assists is intimidating. It's really hard to transition from ABS to no ABS, and from full traction control to zero. It's definitely an adjustment, and we've all gone through that learning curve. When I first started playing the F1 games, I desperately wanted to turn all these assists off in order to achieve more realism, but every single time I tried to do so, I would lock up, spin out of corners, miss braking points, and make mistakes in almost every corner. I absolutely hated it, and after 10 minutes of driving with no assists, I was back in the settings menu turning them back on. Driving with these assists always bothered me, and I always saw YouTube videos explaining how much faster it was to drive with them off, but I just couldn't do it. One day I sat down and I was determined to turn them off for good, and the transition was actually much easier than I thought it would be. At first it's going to be miserable, but it'll quickly turn around. The reason that disabling assist makes you faster is because you gain so much more control over the car. When you trail brake, you can feel the edge of the limit for the brakes and really push the car to brake as late as you possibly can. When getting back on the power at mid-corner, you have so much more control over the behavior of the car. When turning the racing line off, you can focus so much more on the flow of the car and the track ahead. These are absolutely crucial points for getting faster. If you drive with assists on, I know you're comfortable with it. Even if you've absolutely mastered the F1 game but you have these assists on, disabling them will open up an entire new world of lap times. To start driving without assists, the best possible thing you can do is to get into time trials and to practice. You're going to lock up, spin out, miss braking points, and make a whole plethora of mistakes, and it's going to be frustrating. However, if you stick with it for just a little while, you'll relearn the game as a whole and have access to so much more control over the car's behavior. If you still struggle with turning off ABS, traction control, or the racing line, I have 3 videos that go very in-depth to each of those subjects. As always, if you have any questions about the things you're doing wrong, feel free to leave a comment on this video or in my Discord. I'm happy to help. I hope this video gave you some more insight into these tips and helps you improve your lap times across the board. That's going to do it for this one, so if you enjoyed the video or it helped you out, please leave a like or consider subscribing. So if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.